Is this the water?
Yes.
Oh, so you're trying to do like emulation of the analog circuits and stuff like that?
Some of my modeling was going on.
Cool.
And once I had
So it sounds like you're a fan of non-linearity.
yeah.
Great.
I think my parents were there.
Oh, really? What did you say?
Yeah. The archive recorded sound process, that kind of stuff. Not around here. Yeah, I know. In fact, I don't think we have any disc players, but I do have an old preamp, or a preamp. Hey, John?
Yes, have you been to the?
Where do we meet on So you go left at the light before you.
Let's see,
It's like
you come
when
from
people were living there.
Yeah, well, just follow Charles.
They must have felt like there was no way out.
It's just
I mean, this
before
is
you get
where
to
they
San
were, and they
Antonio.
were getting out there.
Yeah, you come
And
in
their,
with
you know,
like say
their
that
children, their children's children are all
free about
together.
it.
Yeah,
On how they
after
developed,
that
it's all
light
about
that goes, there's a light before San Antonio.
There's lights, yeah, there's lights all along.
No, but just immediately.
Queens.
Hey John, can you just do the boards? Wipe the whiteboard. So.
It's in Astoria.
The road that goes along.
That's really.
I can't, there's an entrance actually off Charleston.
Up Charleston,
Okay.
that's the entrance.
Okay.
If you come to San Antonio, you've gone too
Yeah,
far.
no, I understand this. I know the building, there's a big theater.
Yeah, it's a great
Thanks.
building. Half a block before you get to San Antonio.
We don't do this in Ohio.
You
I
never know.
know.
That's why they're everywhere, and the internet goes everywhere, so.
No, I was just pulling your leg.
Yeah, I know.
No, I get this all the time from Chris. You know, she's got over 10 patents.
Oh.
And, you know, she takes this stuff serious and we have these conversations and then she just goes, good.
Yeah,
Conversation ended.
I've been working with a guy the guy who invented heater monitors, actually. He's got a really new disruptive technology.
We were talking about that last week.
Yeah, and he has meant nothing but.
Physicists.
I mean, it's amazing.
Just interesting.
You know, to talking about something like, you know, to clients. Great guy, he knows a ton of stuff.
Yeah.
It's so difficult to talk to him. It's not like, you know, you talk to another academic.
Right.
I talk about what I'm doing, you talk about what you're doing.
Right.
You know, when it's industry, it's like, you know, we're talking about what you're doing. I don't say a thing.
That's right. Yeah, I know. Well, they have a stack of NDAs like that.
And then it's also clear that you'll talk about something and you realize your eyes glaze over because they know all that.
Right, right.
You know, you're publishing it for the first time. They did that 10 years ago and they haven't redo it anyway. So you're looking at their eyes, seeing them glaze over. And then they start poking you for a particular thing. And you realize, oh, they don't know about that. Yeah, it's not give and take. I mean, but they're fine people, right?
And no, that's what you gotta do if you wanna work.
Exactly, you gotta work in an environment.
You know, they try to.
Mostly they
places like Arma.
Yeah.
And there's only so far they can go. And it says you got a four string. And they're fooling around with a compass for everything.
And it's another thing that you have to live like.
Oh, yeah, well, I know. Yeah, that could be good. Yeah, you know, because you like to talk about.
I know. But Kristen knows that I'm on that one, so she knows.
Well, I you know,
from
Tried not to.
kind of math.
Philippines, but you know, it's kind of hard. Something I can't remember who.
Which means are exactly
I think
one by the word started around it, there's no means to special
Right.
Central interest are probably computer science.
But they have to come from somewhere. This is where a lot of them come from.
Courtesy of point of view.
Great. Published to do
So use it as maybe that's
when I published my book from 2006, I got a year later, I got a letter from a retired advertising executive, and it was a very exciting letter. And it was one of the chapters in my book. I made this particular and then he talked about how 25 years ago, this big advertising firm that he'd worked with, he had discovered this in the trade secret. Now that I published it, now I could talk about it. But it was sort of, he held the sound as 25 years ago. And it was sort of, as somebody who works in academia, it makes you wonder how many other things.
Oh, yeah.
Do you think that you're discovering which is just common knowledge of that? Yeah, at least it's confirmation. But it was so interesting. You could see the excitement, and then writing it was finally it's something else.
You read it earlier.
It's very interesting to see what's happening in subatomic parts of physics.
Yeah, oh yeah.
They're starting to proliferate ideas and theories where they know darn well that we're going to be able to test and that's kind of interesting because then it starts reverting back to medieval ways of it becomes it's no longer science, it's hermeneutics. Where you have the same sort of thing and you're interpreting it this way or that way, it's the same data.
Reading between the lines in the abstract.
So it's a lot like traditional hermeneutics. You take a text and you describe what you think is what it means.
Makes a approximation on what the segregation mechanism should have been. Actually, vintage recording carries through all of it.
It makes you realize that what makes something scientific is as soon as you run out of data, it becomes hermeneutic.
We can't go.
So what happens in the case of technology, for example?
Thank you everyone for coming. It's great turnout.
As long as you have hardly any historical.
We're delighted to have Carl Haber join us from the Lawrence Berkeley National Lab. Since 1986, he has worked at the laboratory. He's in the physics division and has since beginning research on the preservation and restoration of recorded sound. In 2002, he has worked as an archivist at the Library of Congress, the Thomas Edison National Historic Site, the PBA Hearst Museum of Anthropology, and the Smithsonian Institution. And as many of you heard, he was recently awarded the MacArthur Genius Grant, so a lot of confirmation that great work is going on. So he was here 7 years ago. We get to see how he's advanced these optical techniques for preserving antique medias.
Thank you. Thank you. Good afternoon. Yeah, I was very pleased to be here this afternoon, and I was here 6 or 7 years ago, and I gave a talk. I don't know if any of you or some of you came. Since that time, we've had the opportunity to work on a considerable number of truly historic recordings, things from the 19th century that kind of are milestones of the development of sound recording. I talked, I think, the last time a lot about some of the technical issues, and I'll touch on some of those, but I want to be able to play and show you a variety of really interesting examples from this early period, so I will spend some time on that as well. Okay, right, so this talk and this whole investigation, it sort of, I think it kind of touches on three themes. So, one thing is obviously our history in among other ways, is represented in recorded sound. And there are challenges to preserve and create access to the archive, unquote. And so we're sort of addressing that in some general way. This also, and then these pictures are just supposed to be kind of iconic of kind of the field recordings that were so important in ethnography and anthropology, the historical recordings, for example, residential collections, and then the musical legacies. And then I think we also are touching on, all the many different ways in which quantitative methods are now being applied to humanities collections. And there are many things in that. So this is kind of the scholarly representation here. And then, as I started off by saying, this work is giving us a really great window on the late 19th century, which people kind of refer to as the heroic period of invention, because there were these individual, inventors that kind of went off on their own. But really, if you think about it, the analog and even the digital concepts that underlie this information-based world were explored in some way in this period. Okay, so it's kind of just a timeline, just to kind of give you a feeling of, on one slide, of when and all the incredible things that were going on in a fairly short period of time. Kind of starting in the 1820s and the 1830s with the development of still photography. Then Morse invented telescope, I guess. And then many of you know that actually the first sound recordings were done around 1860 by Leon Scott on a machine called the phonautograph. In 1876, telephone. Same year, Muybridge, he did motion capture. So now we see sampling in some sense, really, for the first time. I think just down the road somewhere around here this was done. 1877, Edison and the tinfoil phonograph, so now we could reproduce sound. Edison kind of lost interest, and in these intervening years, Bell and Charles Tainter and a number of the people did a big, long effort to research audio formats and kind of move this into a practical technology. In the mid-1890s, wireless, actually it's out of order, but a few years before that, this man, Jesse Fuchs, who you may not have heard of, was basically the first person to be credited with, taking a recording machine out into the field and recording somebody, outside of a laboratory or a studio. And this was the beginning of essentially anthropological or linguistic recordings as essentially a collecting research tool. And then, ending the century with the development of electronic components and the possibility to amplify sound. So Edison's invention, he claims, I put lead because, there are many accounts of what happened. But the claim was that he was experimenting with methods to record telegraph impulses on paper discs so you could fire them off much faster than you could type them out. And the cacophony that resulted led him to the idea of recording, instead of a discrete code, the continuous impulses of the voice on a material. And this is the patent diagram showing the recording and listening implements and a cylinder which rotated, and it was covered with tinfoil. And so his idea was to emboss sound into tinfoil. So this is a picture of an actual tinfoil from just a few months after Edison first presented the invention. And it's a museum collection. It's, I don't know, about 15 inches long, 5 inches wide, and it was wrapped around the mandrel. And you can see in this little blown-up picture a little section of the groove. And if you look carefully, you can even see the embossed pattern due to the sound. So don't worry how we took these pictures. I'll come back to that later, but I just want to explore the physical dimensions of this item. So this is the direction of time, and so the time would go like this, and then it would come around and so forth. And so if you look along this red line, this is what the surface looks like, and the extent of that undulation is indicated by this arrow, which is supposed to be 50 microns. So that's like human hair sort of scale. If you look across, so now you're looking at one slice at different times. And so there you can see actually the shape of the groove. The pitch separation between grooves is about 1 millimeter. And again, the depth is set, the 50 micron scale is shown by that arrow. So this is basically the earliest reproducible recording format. Many things then happened. People did variations on this, which I'll go through in some detail. But if you kind of let things settle down, by 1940 or so, even earlier, but certainly in the 30s and 40s, this was a very, very common and well-accepted format, the so-called 78 RPM phonograph record that many of you have seen. I sometimes have to remind people that this is not a black CD. But anyway, you can see the microphotograph of the groove undulating from side to side and the big stylus in there. And here's the scale. In Edison's foil, the sound is stored in a vertical, up and down, undulation of the surface. On the 78, it's a side to side. So the groove here is 75 microns or 80 microns deep, so it's a bit deeper than this. The pitch is, in this case, is sort of half the pitch here. The movement of the groove is from submicron up to roughly some number in this kind of ballpark. So I mean, there's a lot of intervening technology, but not a vastly different thing. Changing the direction, changing the scale, but that's where the technology kind of ended up, and then eventually the LP that many of us certainly know. Okay, so early recorded sound is dominated by these so-called mechanical or grooved formats. Not completely, but for the most part. Grooves moved either side to side, as in the 78 that I showed you, or vertically, as in the foil. Particularly as you get back into the early period, people were experimenting and they were trying all sorts of things. And so there were diverse materials, diverse configurations, and they just tried many, many things. And so these pictures are sort of supposed to imply all of that. Here's the foil that you just saw a moment ago. There's the 78. This one's broken. The cylinder with a helical groove was a very important and common format. In a certain period in the 20s and 30s, the discs were made of metal. Here's an experimental disc, which is wax on brass. Here's a copper electrotype of a cylinder. This is actually a disc that was recorded photographically. Here's a little mechanism of, which is meant to be like a cylinder, but a really tiny thing that went inside a doll. So just a huge variety of different takes on this idea of sound recording media. It turns out, and I think we're fortunate, that much of the evidence of early sound recording has been preserved in collections, the recording carriers themselves. In many cases, the machines, even the experimental ones, are in important collections. And the notes and documentation in the experimental period of the things people were doing and they were thinking about. Unfortunately, the materials are not always the greatest things, and they, in many cases, have not been cared for as well as you would have liked over the years, so they're at risk. Problematic in various ways, or even in some cases unplayable in that they're in many pieces. Carriers are delicate, damaged, playback systems, particularly as you get back into the experimental period, may not even have existed, like, oh, we've made a recording, but we have no way to play it. Archives, in general, wanted to preserve digitally these extensive collections, and they'd like to do it as soon as possible. So the project that we've been working on in Berkeley, in collaboration with the Library of Congress and a bunch of others, which I'll detail at the end of the talk, is based upon this question, could we use optical methods to digitize a recording without contact to it? Kind of like tech scanning, robotic tech scanning that you do for books. If you could do that, it opens up a whole bunch of issues or capabilities that people who care about preservation, archiving, and in the research community care about. For example, you can potentially restore or stabilize delicate or damaged media by essentially moving them into not the media itself, but moving the information into a different domain. There are large collections, and there's a priority to digitize them kind of on a mass scale. So optical methods, robotic concepts, that speaks to automation, the ability to process the large collections in an efficient way. Merely assessing on a kind of very fine scale, the condition of material is very, very important for conservators, just to know. How do I triage this? In what category does it belong? And then, of course, as I've highlighted before, the formats, as we go back, are obsolete. The playback systems, if they even exist, are legacy systems that become increasingly hard to even find or maintain. So, a virtual approach is attractive. So this is a kind of comic strip of how you might do that. So you have this is just emblematic of some of the media. This is some kind of an arrangement of optics and motion control that allows you to collect appropriate images off, in this case it's a cylinder. So this is supposed to indicate kind of a series of profiles of the surface. So for example, if you went, the grooves go like that, so if you went across the grooves, you might see a bunch of up and down structures that correspond to the encoded sound along the line. You do multiple passes like this in a kind of raster form, and then you merge them together, and you get this being a tiny chunk, but you get basically a huge topographic three-dimensional or two-dimensional representation of the entire surface. Archive it, so now you've got something that you can hold on to, and then analyze it, basically calculate how a needle would move through such a surface if it actually moved through it. You can apply restorative algorithms to, say, interpolate out scratches or gaps, reassemble broken pieces together, all digitally, and then from that create an audio waveform. So that's schematically what we or people would try to do, coming from this direction. So I'm going to now talk about the actual optical measurement modes that seem to be of value in this approach. Okay, so in the case of the 78 or related phonograph record, as I said, the groove moves from side to side. So microphotography, just sort of two dimensions, meaning you take something and you map it onto the imaging intensity plane of a camera, can result with sufficient resolution in images that sort of look like this. So this is just a tiny, tiny little chunk, maybe less than 1 millimeter by 1 millimeter of the surface of a phonograph record. Now, what we're doing here is we are projecting light onto the surface coaxially. So all the light is perpendicular to the surface of the record. And so this is supposed to be the groove, and all the light are these vertical lines. And so anything that's flat reflects light back up into the camera. Anything that's not reflects it off in some other direction. And so that's where you get this very high contrast image. This very bright white line is the very bottom of the groove. And then this sort of more ragged structure is the top of the groove. That's the surface. Here you see a nice little scratch that's going through. There's a dust particle. And so that's kind of, little zoology of this little chunk. If we blow it up, you can actually see that dust particle, or I don't know what it is, some piece of foreign material that's lodged down in the groove. Depending upon what it is and how well it's attached to its surroundings, if the stylus went through here, it might go click. Yeah.
So do I get frequency information from the number of wiggles?
Yeah, right,
amplitude
exactly,
variation by
exactly. So this this actually tells you how the needle would move as it went through there, and this being the time range.
And so the needle wants to follow your flat trough in the
Right. Well, the needle actually basically sits snugly up against the wall. It's, depending on how big the needle is, it will sit at a particular depth. Typically not along the bottom. That would not be considered the place they want the needle to be. They want the needle to be up on the walls. But the great thing about a sound recording is that the information is stored in the profile redundantly. There are multiple copies of the same information because it was all cut like with a shovel that was cutting through the master. Here's an arrangement of cameras and a turntable all under the control of a computer that can collect such images. As a practical matter, the images are collected using a line scan camera. So that's one line of 4,000 pixels that's aligned along the radius. And then as the record rotates, the encoder, which is part of the rotating mechanism, triggers the camera. Let's say if it's a 78 RPM disc, you trigger the camera 80,000 times. As you go around, that's around 100 kilohertz of time sampling. Okay? The resolution that you need to get the information that is present there is about 1 micron on the 1 square micron on the surface of the disk should map to about 1 pixel in the imager. Now, one very, very crucial thing is that to have this kind of resolution, you end up with a very, very narrow depth of field. So the region that's in focus is just 10 or 20 microns. So records are warped, and it's very important to maintain focus. I mean, in life, it's important to maintain focus. I don't tell my children that, but here we have an active, basically laser-based focusing system that maps the warpage of the record and keeps the optics at a fixed distance as the record wants.
What's the RPM of your turntable?
There's a variety of RPMs. It depends upon, it's a variable, and it depends upon at what exposure time we're firing the camera and how bright the light is. But it basically maps to, we can collect data in near real time. Real time means it would have taken 3 minutes to play the thing. We can collect the data in 10 minutes, 15 minutes, some factors of 2 or 3 less than real time as a practical matter. Okay. Now, once you get this kind of information, how do you get the information out? Well, it's actually a fairly simple process. You can extract this groove information basically by looking at the high contrast transition to the image, edge detection. Okay? So this is a tiny little chunk of some groove, and I picked it because it was pretty smeared up. And so you can see that the edges are very regular. They're picking up the sides of the groove, but then there's a region where something is damaged or smeared, and you can see that the field of edges then becomes much more diffuse. Okay? This is a very important handle on noise reduction because you can establish through huge numbers of edges that you're measuring that the usual distance across the groove is some amount characteristic of the specific disk. Once a pair of edges exceeds that, it's clearly not groove-like anymore, and it belongs to a different family. Okay? And so that's an important handle on noise, which you can exploit if you want. Okay, so this is a strategy for collecting what we call 2D images off of lateral grooves. Okay? Now, as I told you, the cylinder has a groove that undulates vertically, so this photographic approach is not really appropriate for cylinders. And so there we use a three-dimensional imaging strategy, and there are many three-dimensional imaging strategies, and we've looked at a variety of them, but the one that works the best is a form of confocal microscopy. Confocal microscopy is a broad subject that has many different approaches that all fall under this one title, but the form we're using is called color coding. What happens is you put light, white light here, not monochromatic light, white light through a lens that has a large chromatic aberration, and the different colors come into focus at different depths. Okay? So that's the simple optical concept here. Usually you don't want this in photography because it makes it smears the color along edges and it's not nice. So here you have your white light source. Here's the outerating lens. Here's that loci of foci. And then essentially there's a spectrometer, which is part of the system, that can read back which color is in focus. Okay? And that codes the depth. So as a practical matter, the distance from here to here in the system that we use is around 300 to 400 microns, so kind of a third of a millimeter. And then within that range, as the surface moves through, you can measure the depth with a resolution, depending upon the slope, of between 50 and 100 nanometers. So this is a good scale relative to the kind of movements that encode the sound on the vertically cut medium. So this is supposed to show you that you can run this probe around a cylinder and across, and you can cover the entire surface. As a practical matter, these things come in packages with 180 of these in parallel on a 10 micron grid. So you can very efficiently cover a surface. These things can take data at hundreds to almost 2,000 captures a second. So it's a very powerful and well specified tool for mapping the surface of one of these objects. So this is, in this little picture, I'm imagining that this is that tin foil, and in fact, here's that same picture that we looked at when we saw Edison's invention. In fact, the picture you probably guessed by now that I showed you was taken with this system. And if you look across the little imprints that Edison's system made, you see the shape of the groove. And so if you want to know the depth, you essentially, we're not doing edge detection anymore because we have the full three-dimensional profile, so you're actually looking at how the depth is varying by characterizing this shape and then modeling its depth as a function of position.
So when you said each capture was your 180 colors or something?
Right,
like that?
no, 180 points.
Sure.
Each point contains multiple colors. The color that's in focus codes the depth.
And how do you know what's in focus? Again, it's the trough that you're...
No, because this thing has a spatial filter, and so this is conjugate. So whatever this spectrometer tells you is the color that's coming through the pinhole. It's pinhole, pinhole, point. So the whole system maps through these 3 points. Anyway, as a practical matter, the whole thing gets implemented, on an optical bench, separated from vibration. This is the actual confocal probe. It's 18 or 20-inch object. This is the camera that does the line scanning. Here you've got a cylindrical system under computer control. Here you've got a disc under computer control, and this is a big stage. You can move these things back and forth and do the measurements and collect the data in a kind of reconfigurable way. And this is supposed to show you that the confocal system, gives you images like this, and the two-dimensional system gives you images like that. Can't see the laser, it's kind of behind here, but that's the control system that keeps everything in focus.
What's the acquisition time for the depth one, the three-dimensional?
Well, okay, so as I said, you can take hundreds to almost 2,000 points of point clouds per second. As a practical matter, to cover a full, say, cylinder, it can take you anywhere from, say, 20 minutes to a couple hours, depending upon how much sampling you want. Okay? So at the heart of the analysis of this data, particularly this so-called three-dimensional data, are pictures like this. Okay, so this is a little chunk taken from one of those three-dimensional acquisitions. This looks like photograph, but it's a depth image, so dark is deep. Okay, so here the needle would be running up this little valley here, and you can see that there are places where it goes down and up and down and up. So if you follow this red line, that corresponds to this this track over here. This little arrow is 10 microns, so you can see a lot of information on the micron or even submicron scale. But interestingly, you can see these sharp features that are showing up from here, here and there. Okay, those correspond to these structures that are outlined in orange. Generically, these are called blobs. But what they are is, these are basically holes in the surface, which in this particular case were due to the action of mold that attacks the wax and eats it. That's one of the diseases of these sound recordings. If you see something white, that's typically above the surface. It could be dust or something like that. If it's very straight, it's typically a scratch. But this very almost organic, biological-looking structure, is actually these little mold colonies that eat the surface. This is a very long list of topics that I really don't have time to go into, but implicit in behind this picture are algorithms to actually track in increasingly difficult situations. For example, in the presence of a crack, how do you do that? Detecting these blobs in a scale-independent way, so you don't need to set a lot of parameters. You don't need to tell it, what size blob you're looking for. Interpolating across these structures if you want to do a smoothing operation. Procedures for identifying either shapes, as in quasi-parabolic shapes, or edges. Statistics, how to remove outliers from the data set. And then, in the end, if you think about it, the sound we hear is not the position of the stylus, but it's actually the stylus velocity. That's true of electrical recordings, and it's actually true of acoustic recordings as well. And so, all of this ends up being numerically differentiated to actually get the sound out, resampling, wavefile creation. So that's a long process that underlies all of this. Okay, just a little example of dust removal. These are white particles, obviously, and they've been blob isolated and then removed. The contrast changed because it rescales to the minimum and maximum of the image. But it's the same, if you look carefully, it's the same image. Okay. So here's just a couple of examples of what you can get out of this. So the first example is from just a contemporary disc that was cut for us at a studio in Berkeley out of lacquer, which is a soft material that you can cut very fine quality into. Does anybody recognize who these people are? Somebody, last time I talked to Smithsonian, they knew who these people were. And that was indeed a disc that was scanned by this two-dimensional optical process and then reconstructed. So the other one I'm going to play you is, this is actually a cylinder which was cracked, and it was from 1906. And it was a mechanism as part of this fortune-telling machine that you put money into, and it would randomly, go from one place to the other. So this is the three-dimensional scanning. So I've written some of her words, and you can follow along. Oops. Okay, so I see that you could actually understand what she's saying. This is a little hard to read. This is actually a two-dimensional image from a lacquer-cut disc that was made for us that just contained pure sinusoidal tones. So we used this to see whether we could reproduce the amplitudes that were recorded at each frequency in correspondence. And so your eye should follow the yellow and the purple points. Those are the written and played back. I mean, the yellow being the played back and the purple being the recorded one. So and actually the data goes beyond what's shown here. So it was an attempt to show that you actually can measure the frequencies and amplitudes pieces that are recorded. Okay, so now, so that's the kind of the basis of the whole thing. And so beginning in 2003, we developed this kind of into these sort of working systems. Again, as I said, working really closely with the Library of Congress. And sort of there are three kind of branches to this. So one is like a set of tools to handle diverse materials and perform, at this point, kind of pilot studies of collections. Okay? So this kind of activity applies to, let's say, field collections containing kind of a few thousand items, things that might be at risk. And then tools to process large collections and kind of focus on how you would actually do a workflow. So this really comes out of the needs of the library and you know, faster and robust hardware and software, so a technician can really sit down, press a button, enter some metadata, take the data, it gets automatically filed away, rated, characterized, checked, and all of that. Okay? And then sort of the third branch has been working with a whole bunch of different collections, the Smithsonian, the Edison site, and so forth, kind of looking at the history of audio technology and getting access to, you know, examples of, as I said, historic milestones. So in the area of digitization of, you know, pilot collections, one thing that I think worked out really well was in 2011 and 2012, we did, looking at two collections, we did a kind of systematic digitization of some 80 cylinders of a larger collection. And these are all transferred by this young lady, Mary Rose Berrios, who at the time was a UC Berkeley physics student. She developed a whole systematic procedure and, you know, organized the whole campaign. And she did, in a part-time function, she did 20 per week. And she developed, you know, an entire process. She created a database, and this is a little bit of it. It's online. It shows the cylinder reference numbers, their origin. These are Native American field recordings from the early 19th century, California, at UC Berkeley, the name of the piece, and then links to versions of the audio that you can play back. There's a conference called Breath of Life every 2 years in Berkeley, which is aimed at Native American language revitalization, and she presented this material at Breath of Life in 2012. This is a photograph from a film that was shot by the anthropologist Franz Boas in 1930 on Vancouver Island. And this film has a series of a couple dozen cylinders that correspond to the segments of the film. So Mary Rose also digitized about 20 of those. And if you look carefully, you can actually see the sound recording machine in the background as this other individual is performing a dance. So the Burke Museum in Seattle, which is the group that's interested in this, actually wants to try to find a way to marry the sound recordings and the film. Here's the some of the results of the work Mary Rose did on California collections. So this is not the counties of California. These are the languages which are spoken among Native Americans. There's more linguistic diversity in early California than in the rest of the United States of America. Presumably because of the hospitable climate and, you know, good living arrangements, people didn't need to travel at, you know, following animal herds and so forth. So these are just three of those, that long list that went on beyond the page. I guess a very famous part of the collection are the Ishi recordings. I don't know, people familiar with the story of Ishi? Okay, so these are actually listed on the National Sound Recording Preservation list 2 years ago. I'll play this one. It's the whole wood duck story. It's 50 cylinders that went on for a long time as he told this story. This is just a little snippet of it. There's a stylus version and then which was from an old campaign where they digitized these using styli, and then the optical version. That chopping sound is a mold damage region of the cylinder that you keep hitting every time the cylinder goes around. These rotated at around 130 130 to 160 revolutions per minute. Okay, so then here's the optical version of the same cylinder. So basically there you've got the optional block correction going in there and removing some of those effects that you're hearing very strongly in the stylus version. Okay, another thing that came out of this work was this example. So here's a cylinder. You've seen these pictures before. This is a view along this direction. This cylinder was overcut. So what happened was the amplitudes were just too large. And so the cutting tool actually left the surface on the upswing. And so this is something which should have looked like that, but in fact it just ends up chopped off, okay? So this kind of leads to nonlinearities beyond those that are already present. You can't fix that, but I believe there's a dynamic effect going on when you actually play something like this with a stylus. When it's no longer captured in the groove, it's unconstrained, and you get a distortion, which you can hear is reduced in the optical version of the same material. So let me play this for you. So this is the stylus version. Another thing that we've done with these wax cylinders is we've worked on broken cylinders. So we've come up with a number of strategies. Here's one where you sort of take the separate pieces and temporarily constrain them with a kind of conservator quality polyethylene strap, which just comes right off. You hold the broken materials in place, and then you scan, and then you shift the strap over and you scan another region, and you can start to put the broken pieces back together then digitally. For things that are broken into, say, more than 2 pieces, we've developed fixtures for actually holding individual pieces, scanning them, and then, like a jigsaw puzzle, they can all be reconverged into the full recording. This is a case where I've manifestly left the effect of the crack in there, and you can clearly hear it. Now this is another example. This was a mildly mold damaged cylinder, which is not part of a field collection, but is another type of cylinder that you come across, which are personal dictation records. Okay, this one is historically interesting because it's actually a recording of Jack London himself dictating a letter, and it's pretty much one of the only, well, it's the only known recording of Jack London. There are some other cylinders that we haven't worked through yet, but that's pretty much it. So you'll actually hear Jack. And this is, I won't play the whole letter, just the beginning, and then there's this sort of incredible sound bite where he talks about his experiences in prison. So a letter to Max Ehrman, who was another writer. Jack was very prolific letter writer.
Right, when out, right, much I found there was unacceptable and almost unthinkable.
Okay, I don't know if that corresponds to how you imagine Jack London sound. Okay, so the final thing I want to talk about with these field collections are aluminum discs. Very challenging and interesting material that was used in a narrow time period from the mid-20s to the early 30s. Big old machine that people would lug around, and they would emboss the groove in soft metal. They were considered to be noisy and loud. The grooves are incredibly shallow as compared with any of the other grooves that we encounter, say 5 microns, just really, really small. So essentially, they were meant to be played back with like a cactus needle. If you try to play them back today, you have to take multiple takes because the needle just wants to jump out. We're doing this work in collaboration with the Millman Perry Collection of Oral Literature at Harvard. Perry was a classicist who traveled to Yugoslavia. He made like 6,000 of these records of the South Slavic folklore, which was the basis of his studies of the epic poetry. Here's the profile of such a disc, and you can see here's the groove. Okay, from here to here is just 5 microns. So they're really, really tiny, and you can see the embossed material which has been pushed out of the groove as it's been cut. That's why it's got this little white highlight. So that's the stylus playback, and here's the optical playback of the same disc. So very similar, but the practical reality of playing these things is facilitated by not having to run a stylus through them. All right, so broken discs are a very important area of work here, and the thing that happens with broken discs is that as soon as something is broken, all the separate pieces start to just change individually. Stresses are relieved. So I talked to you a lot about focus earlier when I was talking about the imaging strategies, and you know, the two pieces on either side of a crack are just always ending up at different heights. So we've actually developed strategies whereby our system can double scan and calculate trajectories. This is the camera's motion to get complementary regions in focus, and then we can merge the images using the best pixels from two. And then other strategies for linking grooves. So here's an example of broken disc. Okay, that's the two fat polka. Anyway, okay, then this is just the GUI that we developed in collaboration with the library that lets actually technicians and untrained people run this whole system in a real kind of user-friendly way. This metadata, entry, operator indicators through click boxes about the condition of the material, and then just a set of half a dozen simple commands to ensue the measurement, and then tools to allow them to see the progress. So the Library of Congress has used this. It's all installed there. There's a big kind of database that it drives. It keeps records of all the measurements that are being done and takes pictures of the label and here's all the focus data as it goes around and around. And they did a kind of production test of some 600 discs using this. Okay, so finally, I want to now do the last section of the talk about the history of the technology and our kind of little trip into the 19th century. Okay, so here's kind of the milestones as you go back through time. And we've had the opportunity to work on all of these. I'm not going to have time, or in some cases I don't have permission to play things on all of these points, but kind of the things to keep in mind were that in the mid-1890s, the first film soundtracks were experimented with. This is called the Dixon cylinder. It's something that Edison worked on. In the late 1880s and early 1890s, Emil Berliner, he made the disc a practical commercial medium. The very first attempt to commercialize sound recording, as far as we understand, happened in 1887 with a talking doll that you could buy. In the early 1880s, Bell and his collaborators worked on many different types of sound recordings in what's called the Volta Lab. In 1877, Edison recorded and reproduced sound for the first time. In 1860, Edward Lee and Scott de Martinville recorded sound on paper, but he didn't actually reproduce it. Okay. So here's the talking doll. That's what she looked like. There's a mechanism that went inside, and it had this little disc on it, which, this being the prototype, was found in a drawer in the Edison site in New Jersey some years ago. It was brought to our lab. We built a plastic mandrel to hold it. It's all bent and out of shape. This was not a success. This was not the iPad, okay? It was a flop, and it was called The Little Monster by Edison, and he had all the inventory buried. Okay? And I found this newspaper article that said it was a complete disaster, terrifying children and costing their parents a month's pay. That's like the iPad, but... It's pretty bad. I think you can hear that that's Twinkle Twinkle, right? Okay, so then in the early 1880s, we get to the Volta Lab. So in 1880, Alexander Graham Bell established the Volta Laboratory at this address. It's now an empanada stand. I actually went there. To conduct research on sound recording. He formed an association with his cousin, Chichester Bell, who was a chemist, and an instrument builder who he met in Cambridge called Charles Sumner Tainter. This was an amazing period of, say, 5 years where they experimented with an astounding variety of materials. And they produced, I don't know, half a dozen or 10 patents before settling on the wax cylinder, which we heard examples of in the field recordings, as a recording medium of choice. So the wax cylinder really comes from this, not from Edison. Most of the experimental materials from this are in the collection of the Smithsonian. And these are just some pictures of a variety of items that are of different nature that form this Volta Laboratory collection. Okay. They looked at, Edison used the stylus to cut in a record and replay it from the foil. These guys, they looked at photography, they looked at the mechanical stylus cutting into wax, they looked at spraying jets of liquid and air and using that as a transduction mechanism. They tried writing with magnetic ink and then using a magnetic reader. And they looked at copying and reproduction methods that could lead to a commercial process. So they really, it was a very far-ranging set of activities. So this is one of my favorite ones. This is the optical recorder of this period. So here's a picture of it in the files. They brought the sunlight into this mirror through this condenser. Okay, they focused it down and it went through this tube into this box. They had a basically lead screw mechanism inside the box where they mounted a glass disc that was photosensitized. As they turned it, the spot of light would hit, a point on the spiral trajectory as the disc moved. Here you can see the result of this modulated exposure. It's a density modulated photographic representation of sound. The way they modulated the sound was they had a reservoir in which they put essentially, it was a dye of potassium bichromate, and they allowed it to go down a tube and spray a jet of liquid against the glass plate, and then they would basically talk to this board, and it would cause the nozzle to move, which would modulate this dripping ink, and that would modulate the sound. Okay. They had a different version of this that actually modulated the sound laterally as well. So that this was the density modulated and the area modulated, which became the two film formats that you may be familiar with some 40 years later. Okay. This was their little, description in the patented jet of bichromate potash, that's potassium bichromate, vibrated by the voice, was directed against the glass plate immediately in front of the slit by means of a lens, and so forth. Just exactly what I told you. So here is the actual recording. It goes on for some time. So I've broken it up so you can actually follow. They first say their name, one of the names, it's distorted. Then they tell you the date. Then they do a trill. You find a lot of trills in early recordings. It was kind of their version of testing 1, 2, 3. Then they say something to the effect of who put in the pipe. Then they attempt to do Mary Had a Little Lamb, but suddenly it stops, and they say something which is kind of a bad word. Okay. Then there's a gap, and they restart, successfully saying Mary Had a Little Lamb, and then they say, how's that for high, which was an expression of the day which meant we did a good job. So we can take a listen. H.G. Rogers, okay? Okay. Did you get that? Okay, good. I think you're going to be able to hear the bad word. There's a trill. Okay, did you hear the trill? That was that screech. Okay. Okay, now here we go. Is there any children here? Did you get that? I don't know. You guys are too, what? You guys are too polite. Okay. Then, want to hear it again? If you want to hear it again. All right. Okay. Then you hear it again. Okay. And then okay. Now, let me tell you something about the trills. This trill that you heard right over here, it sounds chirped, and you can see that in the sonogram. That's because at this point they were restarting the movement, and so the speed of the disc is changing. Okay, so you can actually see that. And here's the disc. See that black spot? That's where he says the bad word, because everything ground to a halt. We think the pipe must have popped out, or something went wrong, and it was very abrupt. So it's actually the first recorded instant of someone being dissatisfied or frustrated, by something that happened. So there are literary accounts of that happening before 1884, but this is the first,
One you don't.
What? Okay. So the air jet approach was another idea they had. Here, the idea was that the groove would create a varying impedance for a jet. And if you teed off an earpiece into the system, you would actually hear the sound. It's not so crazy because it's like, okay, let's scale up the air pressure as an attempt to hear these things. There's a long paper that Chichester wrote on the sympathetic vibrations of jets, kind of analyzing all of this stuff in the Transactions of the Royal Society. Okay, so this is an example of one of those. This is wax on binder board. You can see that it's all cracked and falling apart in multiple fissures. It's actually the first recording that we know of where we actually hear the speaker identify himself as Alexander Graham Bell. We're quite sure that the vile person who used the bad word was not Alexander Graham Bell, but probably one of the lowly technicians. So this goes on and on. It's counting in dollar amounts, but at the very end, he says this, and you'll actually hear Bell's voice. Well, he was from from Scotland, yeah. And in fact, his father was an elocutionist, and in fact, in a minute you're going to hear his father as well. This is another item from that collection. This is actually it's something with the camera, but it's an electroformed copper copy of a wax disc that they cut in 1881. It's probably the earliest example of a disc record with a lateral cut, a side-to-side cut. So this is the archetype of, you know, the phonograph record that we all, you know, knew and loved growing up. You can see the microphotograph of the side-to-side groove. So it's really short. It's just 3 trills and 6 numbers. But, you know, very clearly you can see the, you know, the undulation side-to-side of that groove. Okay.
On your colored,
On the sonogram. Yeah.
on the sonogram, what's the vertical scale for?
So this is frequency and this is time. So this is showing you what overtones exist. And it's very interesting because there are lots of overtones in the counting, but essentially nothing in the trill, which I've never been able to understand. Okay? So anyway, these are the notes that went with this particular recording, Charles Sumner Painter, October 17, 1881. Our object is to use the copper electrotype for the purpose of forming records or phonograms in other substances by stamping or printing, and to use these stamped copies for reproducing the sounds originally recorded in the composition. In this way, a piece of music could be recorded once and any number of copies made from this original record, and the music reproduced from any or each of the copies. Sounds like he's, you know, pitching this to some VCs, right? I mean, this is a great idea, okay? I don't think he could have envisioned that it would, you know, become this, and then this would come along and cause this to happen. So, in here are the seeds of an industry that would destroy itself. Okay, around the same time, they did this experiment. This was one of Edison's tinfoil players, but what they did is they coated it with wax, and they actually cut into wax instead of into tinfoil. This was the big wax kind of breakthrough. This machine, you can't take the recording off. The recording is the machine. So it's in the Smithsonian. They put it in a big art moving truck, brought it to Berkeley. We set it up in the lab, and we built this little timing belt mechanism with a plastic gear that we built in order that we could turn this thing under the control of our system so that we could properly digitize it. It's a recording of Melville Bell, his father, they call this machine the graphophone to differentiate it from the phonograph. So that's going to explain the little joke in the recording. So then, getting to, almost to the end now, is the tinfoil itself. So this is the foil that I showed you at the very beginning of the talk. It's the earliest Edison recording that has been yet restored. It was recorded in June of 1878 as part of a public demonstration of an early version of the commercial machine. Staged in St. Louis by this man, Thomas Mason, passed through many collectors, and it finally got into this museum in Schenectady, New York. It had been folded 7 times and stuffed in this little envelope with all this interesting fonts. Dates there, June 22nd, 1878. I guess this is a little film of the foil actually being scanned.
Yeah. Other words on what happened.
So it's on like that. Okay. It's about a minute long. It's the same type of reconstruction as you heard before. I broke it up into pieces. There's some clicking. There's an unidentified musical segment. So this is the first musical recording of musical instruments, not singing. Then again, the apocryphal Mary Had a Little Lamb, some laughter, Old Mother Hubbard, and some more laughter. So here's the brass section. No one's been able to identify this piece. Mary. Okay, then, okay, I'll skip ahead, some laughter. Okay, I think you can see why Bell thought he might be able to improve on this. Okay, so finally, the phonautograph. That's now another 17 years back from Edison. This man built this machine, which literally was the sound self-writer. Scott was inspired by the demonstration of photographic capture of images on paper. He said if they can capture light on paper, why not sound? He thought that by using a vibrating diaphragm and a stylus and blackened paper, he could capture the patterns of sound that people would then learn to read. Okay? It would be a stenograph, because there was no playback mechanism. Okay? The interesting thing is that he recorded 2 tracks simultaneously, one being the audio and the other being a tuning fork. So he actually provides you with a real-time scale for all of this. These were found in France in an archive by a bunch of people who were part of a collaboration called First Sounds. They were scanned in a high-resolution scanner, and then we applied essentially the same edge detection analysis that you use for phonograph records. And you can actually play this thing. So now you can actually hear it. Many of you may have heard it. It was actually premiered at the Brown Library in 2008 as part of the Association of Recorded Sound Collections conference. In the corner, written in the same blackened paper, is this translation of Au clair de la lune, sung. The pitch is measured by the tuning fork of 500 simple vibrations per second, which writes directly and simultaneously in interlinear space of the song. Leon Scott, 9th of April, 1860. Okay? So in case you don't know Au clair de la lune, this is not the recording from 1860. Then here's Scott's rendition. There's another recording from a few days later where he just does a scale. So you could actually sample that and make music from it if you want to do. Okay, I just want to close now and just say just a couple things about the project. I think we've had a great education and training component. At Berkeley, we've been able to develop a lot of student participation in this. Some, 15 UCB undergraduates so far, and another kind of 15 or so students that come from Switzerland every summer, work from 3 to 5 months on the project, write significant diplomas, doing all sorts of computer science and electrical engineering type of work. Great opportunity to expose students in engineering and physical sciences, the STEM fields, to these interesting problems in preservation and conservation, which they might not have otherwise, ever encountered. This gentleman works at Google now, and these guys are all, so that's been a great component of the whole thing. So I like to end with this sort of what-if thing. Sound recording, was started in the 19th century, but it really utilizes technology and methods which could have been done much earlier. You didn't need to know chemistry and things that they learned. So I always, wondered, could Da Vinci have invented sound recording? I mean, why not? He was like a really clever guy. So it's interesting because in the treatise on painting, Da Vinci writes that poetry and music are inferior to sculpture and painting because hearing is less noble than sight, in that as it is born, it dies, and its death is as swift as its birth. So, I mean, that's pretty self-defeating because, if you had thought, well, maybe God wants me to record it, his whole idea might have been different, but he just dismissed it out of hand. That's what happens. Okay, these are the wonderful institutions that have supported us over the years. Institute Museum and Library Services, has given us the most financial support. Library of Congress has been our great collaborator and also supporter of all these other wonderful groups. There's been an installation of this equipment at the Northeast Document Conservation Center, which is an organization in Massachusetts that's now offering optical scanning of sound recordings on a fee-for-service basis. These are our other collaborating institutions. Smithsonian has been a great collaborator. That's incredible access to these historic collections there. So I believe that digital technology, provides a window on this early period of sound recording, and it's the rich artistic, historical research and commercial legacies. irene.lbl.gov is the project website if you're interested in them. We're also very happy to collaborate with people if people find this interesting and want to get involved. There's many open questions, particularly technical ones, in the way we analyze the data, and I think opportunities for students, internships. So we're really happy to collaborate and work with people. That's, I think, been one successful part of the project. Thank you.
We have lots of time for questions.
I'll start out. Sure. I have a technical issue, and there's been discussion for the last 50 years about when you first play an LP, does the fidelity decrease for the first playing of the disc? And that gets to the resolution of the vinyl, how small indentation can be made in the process. And, opinions seem to be all over the place. I had a professor who brought this up by tape recording all of his albums the first time he played them, because he insisted that the high frequency was compromised after the first playing with a stylus. Do you have a feel for that? And I guess using optical light, you're constrained to about a micron or so resolution. Is that?
Well, actually, you can do better than a micron because you can do multi-pixel imaging. So in the lateral, first in the 2D imaging strategy, you have your resolution is effectively half to third-ish of a micron once you look on edges.
Mm-hmm.
So you're looking across many pixels, and you're looking at how the intensity varies. And there actually may be strategies to eke out whatever the maximum resolution is, and that's actually one of the research areas that we've been talking about. With the 3D imaging, that is been most successful on vertically cut material, but we've done a lot of work. For example, the aluminum discs are laterally cut, but they're done 3D. Mm-hmm. So with 3D, what you're doing is you're getting multiple measurements of the same structure, so that gives you an averaging capability, which will give you increased resolution on the lateral position. What the ultimate resolution is of 3D scanning on modern stereophonic media, that's an interesting question. We haven't really put effort into modern stereophonic media at all, focusing instead on historical materials that we thought were kind of the at-risk, things that were begging to be studied. But, I think what you're sort of saying is, well, would there be some way to optically play a disc before ever playing it and then play it and see?
Right.
So there is a commercial device called a laser turntable, which basically, it doesn't do what we're doing, which is to profile. It just bounces a light beam off the wall. I think that, and that is a machine which people say works well on pristine discs in very good condition, but not on things that have been distressed, which is our kind of focus. And I think the way to address your question probably would be with laser turntable, doing an A/B comparison, play it and then play it with stylus and then play it again.
Yeah, I've seen electron micrographs, of course, that show
Well, I mean, yeah,
but then you can't.
Right, the question is how do you map that into sound quality?
Right, exactly.
And then you need a metric also. It's it can't just be listening, right? You have to look at frequency response and
right.
Best to be done with a tone test disc.
Mm-hmm.
Other questions? Sure.
in recent years, we've seen things that we thought were impossible become possible. I think things like getting DNA out of old bones of Neanderthals and so on. And it makes you realize that, and one of the problems there is that these things are handled by people. One of the problems that they have with these old bones is that there's a lot of contamination from people who handle them with their hands and so on. And I guess the idea of going back to 1850, you start wondering if there's some way in which we're dealing with things from earlier periods that are potentially detrimental, and 100 years from now, people will say, well, if only we hadn't done that, we would have been able to reconstruct X, whatever that is. And I've heard speculation, for example, that, you know, for thousands of years, there have been potters who had potter wheels, and presumably there were times when a leaf kind of made contact with the potter's wheel and so on, that we might actually have some sounds from earlier periods in ways that we had never imagined. Is there any speculation about this or anything?
Well, certainly, I mean, the subject that, well, okay, so the general thing that you raise about essentially conservation and preservation practice, and, you know, really kind of stepping back and saying, how can we do no harm or minimal harm, I think is a very important question. It transcends anything that we're doing, and, you know, there is a community of people that, you know, worry about these issues, and you know, to the extent that they can take stock in kind of what's gone on, and the realization that there were things that we thought were unseeable, unplayable, unreadable, unmeasurable, they might be, it might lead them to a constructive reassessment of practice. Now, the specific thing about what's called archaeoacoustics, it actually has a name. There are websites and things, and even Mythbusters have treated this problem. And I've heard it, I've been asked this question many times, you know, about archaeoacoustics. So could someone have accidentally recorded sound on a potter's wheel, or, you know, Luigi, the pasta's ready, you know, in Rome or something? My take on this is that that's kind of an urban legend sort of a thing, because you know, when they actually set about to record sound, they had to be pretty deliberate about it. And, you know, we had to be able to have a fairly clear idea of what the process was, mainly linear, maybe with some nonlinearity, but, you know, the whole idea of a leaf or a stylus from a brush or something, there's just so many variables at play there. You know, let's say that you found some wiggle and you sonified it, I mean, you measured it and then chose to interpret that as sound. How would you, you know, what basis would you have to say that this is actually sound? Or, you know, having said that, there is a scholar at the University of Indiana named Patrick Feaster, who was crucially involved in rescuing the phonograms from France. He's written a book recently called Pictures of Sound, 1,000 Years of Recorded Legacy, or something like that. I haven't seen the book, but he actually tries to deal with some of these issues about sound as a visual experience, even before Leon Scott. So you might want to consult the book. It's Dust to Digital is, I think, involved in the publication of it. Some of you may be familiar with Dust to Digital. Anyway, but I personally, I mean, I've been asked many, many times, that's not the archaeoacoustics is not the direction that I'm going to go. But, you know. Yes?
Everything you said would be an example of what we call at SLAC now studies of human heritage, where we're using X-rays to look at objects that go back, using X-ray fluorescence, for example, to look at buried manuscripts, palimpsests, the Archimedes manuscript, for example. Now they're looking at a Quran, which was overwritten, but you can use X-rays to go into that and excite the fluorescence of the iron and the ink of the underlying manuscript, for example. Similar things by looking at the glazes on ancient pottery to see the technology that went into it. I'm mentioning this because among the things that have been studied is the score of, I forget who the composer was, but a lost manuscript or score of some musical piece that was read because it was overwritten with something else.
Sure.
And can be then probed with X-rays which go through the overwritten part. And people have now read the score. I don't remember the details of which composer or what, but caused a bit of a stir in the music.
Well, if we could find the recording that was made from that score, I mean, that we would be able to show that, you know, both photon science and optical metrology bring the tools of physics to the forefront in human heritage. So yeah, I mean, I think there are even other open human heritage issues that the physical sciences could deal with that we haven't even started to look at. I mean, I'm often asked another question is, you know, could you do anything with magnetic media that has been degraded? And not optically, because imaging tape doesn't give you the information, but as you well know, I think there are X-ray polarization things that could be applied. So I think there are areas where the physical sciences, you know, still have contributions that they could make to heritage. Yeah.
Absolutely. Thank you.
Any other questions?
Is anyone pursuing this commercially? There's huge interest in the race records of the 20s and 30s, the heyday of transcribing those and trying to restore those is, I think, behind us. But a lot of those efforts were kind of poor, and it seems this tool has the ability, or this class of tools has the ability to really transcend what's been done in the past.
Okay, so the discussions that have occurred around, you know, creating greater access to this technology, either commercially or not commercially, so the discussion kind of goes like this. If you wanted to make this into a commercial product, you know, the cost right now is sort of prohibitive. And you would have to sell enough of these things, you know, to make it profitable to have a company that, you know, is providing customer support and maintenance and upgrades and all of that. And in the few discussions that have happened around this, those numbers never really seem to add up. Now, what would be good would be to have a small number of these things situated in places where projects that were somehow worthy could, on a kind of fee-for-service basis or something, use the thing to do specific projects. I don't see these as like ending up in homes. I just don't, I think the cost to demand doesn't make sense. But the Institute of Museum and Library Services, which is one of the funders, they supported this nonprofit organization that provides conservation to libraries and museums in Massachusetts to get this equipment and now be able to have customers come in with collections and digitize them. So I think there is a way to do this kind of, wouldn't really call it commercial, but kind of quasi-commercial. And so yeah, I think there's a way forward. No one's ever come up with a good, you know, argument that this becomes a company, which is fine with me. You know, I'm very happy that we can kind of do this as a research thing and aid scholars, and you know, I hope that we'll mount larger campaigns, for example, to digitize field recordings, which are of great value for research, for language revitalization, things like that. But you know, there's not a lot of dollars and cents there. Herman?
Among the organizations you credited with supporting this work was the Department of Energy.
Right.
Do they consider this part of the mission, LDMO?
Okay, so the Department of Energy, when we first tested this idea out in the early 2003 or something, the Department of Energy gave, the laboratory, Lawrence Berkeley Lab, gave us some money to kind of flesh it out and put it in the form that, you know, we could say, is this something that could actually be done in a practical way? That was a relatively small amount of money compared to the money that we eventually raised by writing grant proposals to the National Endowment for Humanities and the Mellon Foundation, whoever. So that was the extent of DOE's, you know, cash outlay, but they did outlay some money. Now, the Department of Energy, I believe, is quite happy that this technology was developed at Lawrence Berkeley Lab, because they tout it as, on the DOE website, Office of Science website, they tout it as one of the laboratory's, you know, contributions. So, and then, you know, they invited me, for example, to come to the science Academic Super Bowl or something. It's this event that DOE runs every spring for high school students to come to Washington and scientists to talk to them. So I think DOE has been supportive, and you know, the laboratory, we've got all the money except for that initial outlay we've been able to raise externally, but the laboratory has been a great host to this. And LBL, DOE, you know, is the kind of place like SLAC where kind of, you know, people can come up with a crazy idea and you won't be immediately laughed off the hill. You know, they will let you do things like this. And I think they're happy, and we're happy. And I think DOE is, I think everyone's happy.
You've done more public relations for Berkeley than any other result.
And if you know how we can get a next generation light source.
Forget it.
Can you speak a little about how good the playback instruments were at that time? I noticed on all your recordings, the people speak very slowly, very deliberately.
Right.
As if, which leads me to think that the playback must have been very noisy and not very...
So most deliberate sounds to be Leon Scott. And I think there he wanted the waveforms to be as long and slow as possible for his kind of stenographic vision.
He even sound like he lowered the frequency. I mean, the frequency and the beat or whatever of his recording was noticeably
lower than the children. Yeah, but I don't know what, you know, people say that we play Beethoven, when we play Beethoven today at an orchestra, we're playing it like way slower than Beethoven wanted it played, and he's got all these markings that play it faster, you know. So, I mean, that whole issue is, I mean, we have to be careful because there's a tendency for us to want to speculate and think, oh, it must have been this way. I mean, people believe that when sound recording was a real novelty, it was a big deal to put yourself in front of one of these things. And so audio, so they were quite deliberate. Audio historians are always very interested in finding recordings which seem to be spontaneous or maybe trying to pick up a contemporaneous sound in the background, because they want to know, how did people sound when they weren't presenting themselves to the horn? Okay? So for example, on the Dixon cylinder, which I couldn't play today because it's not sort of ready for public, there's a little bit of sound where they're playing the violin and filming at the same time, but there's a long lead up where you hear a little bit of chatter off in the background, and people have been very interested in what do they sound like when they don't think of themselves as being recorded. So there may have been a deliberate character of speaking slowly because it was such a formal thing. Let's see. I've answered part of your question, but what was the rest of it?
No, just if you have ideas of how good, how reproducible they're.
Oh, yes, okay. What things actually sounded like in the day. Okay. So, as best we can tell, when they did acoustic recordings at that time, they recorded with horns. And the pictures of those horns usually show them as conical. Okay? So Edison did not have a deep understanding of physics. And, you know, he was kind of seat of the pants. And they said, we need the, you know, they kind of knew a horn, you know, made it more efficient to collect the sound, but they didn't really understand why. I don't think he understood the concept of impedance matching and all of that. There was a man at Clark University in late teens, in 1918 or so, called Webster. And he worked out the waves traveling in different horn profiles, Webster's equations for conical, exponential, and logarithmic horns. Webster showed that the exponential horn had a much better low frequency response than the conical horn. It's kind of well documented. I have a little example of that in another talk where we took one of those recordings and we re-equalized the low end to match the difference between a conical horn and an exponential, and it's fuller. I mean, it definitely sounds fuller. I think they kind of a little bit shot themselves in the foot by not, paying attention, to what would be, but I went to the Edison site and I visited the lab where, sound recording work was done, and there were all these horns up on shelves, and they're all conical. Some of them have 2 cones, but, the flared horn that you're probably familiar with, if you picture one of these old machines, that was a decorative enhancement on the playback machines, just because it looked pretty. But the recording horns were typically conical. It's funny because they knew, I guess, that brass instruments had exponential horns, but not the recording horns. So I think that was a part of the reason why things kind of fell apart at low frequency. Okay. Then the acoustic systems, they kind of die at 3,000 or 4,000 hertz. Just the inertia of the diaphragm goes, and that's it. So you're kind of stuck in that frequency range. Obviously, as people got better and better materials and better material processes, the sound quality improved. I have heard some field recordings from the early 1890s, which sound remarkably better than the Bell experiments that I played for you, even. So, within the confines of your couple hundred to 3,000 or 4,000 hertz, that was it. I mean, that's where they ended up.
I mean, I don't know if coincidentally the telephone bandwidth is 3 kilohertz too. Is that something Bell landed on and figured that's good enough for audio?
I think the telephone technology, as the years went on, I mean, it was a kind of, what's the cheapest thing that we can do that will be, get the message across, and that must have been a trade-off thing that AT&T, the Bell system came upon throughout the intervening years. I mean, so that's a whole story, right? There's a book called Perfecting Sound Forever, which is fairly recent, that explores the whole idea of what should things sound like in terms of recordings.
Mm-hmm.
And then they go through this whole thing about how Edison had this woman who learned to sing in such a way that it sounded just like the playback recordings. And so then she would sing and they would go, look, it's perfect. So, so Perfecting Sound Forever addresses that all the way up through the compression wars of the 1990s and so forth. Yeah.
And that question, how it should sound, do you think of that in this process in terms of, okay, let's use signal processing to get rid of the noise of the mold, and yet you still want to hear the medium, some of the imperfections, we might call it, of the medium in which it was recorded on in terms of this restoration process.
So when our attempts at noise reduction, are not what I would call signal processing. They're more like image processing. Because when we get rid of noise, it's typically done in what I call the image domain, where the scratch and the gap and the mark, or whatever it is, actually originate. Whereas in any kind of post-production, click and pop removal or so forth, there you're looking at a time series and you're looking for sharp features. So we do that. When we do that, we do it in the image. We don't, and there's a lot of smart people that have worked on digital signal processing of audio waveforms, Cedar, Sonic Solutions, companies, and there are the famous algorithms that people know about, spectral subtraction, different filters and so. So we didn't try to kind of get into that whole area because I think it's been pretty well picked over and people know what to do. But the new thing or the additional value that we can bring to it is, trying to do some of this noise reduction at the level of these images before the sound is extracted as an option. You still need to leave a so-called preservation copy that has the minimal stuff done to it. Any other questions?
What's your next challenge? What do you think is left undone?
Well, okay, so I think that we've really gone over a lot of these kind of special historical examples from the 19th century. I mean, there's dozens and dozens of more items in the Bell collection that I think which should be systematically gone through, but that's kind of like a multi-year project, and I would like to see that, because I think just for scholarship, having that stuff cataloged, digitized, and all, I think would be a good thing to have. There are very large numbers of field recordings. These are recordings that anthropologists, song collectors, linguists, ethnographers made in the early years of the 20th century, say the 0 through 30s, all over the world. Thousands and thousands of them in various states of distress or not, okay? Some of them have been digitized by older means, some not. I think that those collections, which are really a world culture, world heritage legacy thing, I think I think it'd be great to have a kind of campaign where you have, I don't know, half a dozen projects around the world using these kind of technologies. So you'd make a concerted effort to develop best practices, share information, and do that. And kind of create digital access to all these collections. I mean, there's Iranian materials, there's materials in Russia, Native American, folk recordings of European villages, and just a huge variety of these things. If you really could create, access to these things, the effect that they could have on researchers, artists, general public, indigenous peoples that maybe have a chance to revitalize languages. I mean, I think there's significant possibilities that you could do good in ways that you might not have even thought of, just by putting it out there. It's good that this kind of stuff is happening concurrently with the internet and all the immediate access that you can have to information once you put it in the digital. So that's that kind of big campaign. I think I would be very happy to see that, but people would have to kind of join in and want to do that. It's not something that is small, it becomes a bigger thing. But that, if we could find some way to do that, I think that would be good.
Great. Well, I think if anyone has more questions, we're going to go down the hill and grab something to eat, so please join us at Trust. Thanks.